In the early dawn hours, an aircraft, an A330, was flying over the Atlantic Ocean amid a violent storm. As it neared the storm's center, a strange smell of fresh grass spread in the cockpit. The plane began to shake violently, accompanied by strange lights. The phenomenon of St. Elmo's fire flared on the windshield, causing the young co-pilot Bonin to feel extreme unease. 8 minutes after these unusual signs appeared, the aircraft carrying 228 people suddenly vanished, mysteriously, into the night, without sending out any distress signal. A modern aircraft flying steadily had abruptly disappeared, causing worldwide shock and panic. It took 2 whole years to retrieve the black box from the ocean floor, unveiling a shocking and unbelievable truth. Hello everyone, I'm Tri. Today I'll tell you the story of the tragedy that sank into the Atlantic Ocean, a crash caused by a stall phenomenon. On May 31st, 2009, in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, night had just fallen. 216 passengers were boarding flight number AF447 operated by Air France at Galeão International Airport. They were preparing for an overnight transatlantic flight, with Paris as the destination, scheduled to land the next noon. The aircraft for that night's flight was a nearly new Airbus A330, only 4 years old. While the aircraft was refueling, passengers settled into their seats. This wide-body twin-engine plane was Airbus's flagship model, at the time, equipped with a modern fly-by-wire system. Aside from one test crash due to pilot error, the A330 model had an excellent safety record, thanks to its advanced automation. The 9,300 kilometers transatlantic journey was assigned to 3 pilots: Captain Marc Dubois, age 58, and First Officer Robert, 37. And the designated flying pilot was Bonin, 32 years old. He had just completed his A330 type rating training. A few months earlier, Captain Dubois was a veteran pilot with over 11,000 flight hours. He was in charge of supervision and communication. Meanwhile, Robert had the most A330 flying experience among the 3 pilots. Although he was mainly in a management role at the time, he joined this flight to maintain his qualification to fly the aircraft as required by law. During the flight, Robert would take over flying duties from the captain during his scheduled 4-hour rest. For many Air France pilots, the Rio de Janeiro route was an attractive assignment, since the city is a famous tourist destination in South America. After arriving in Rio, Captain Dubois and his girlfriend, Bonin, and his wife, as well, had stayed at a seaside hotel in Copacabana. They had 3 days off before the return flight, so they took the opportunity to enjoy a short vacation. At 22:29 Universal Time Coordinated, Flight AF447 was piloted by Bonin and departed from Rio de Janeiro Airport. After about 30 minutes, the plane climbed to its cruising altitude of 10,668 meters, 35,000 feet, flying northeast along Brazil's coastline. Thanks to the autopilot system, the workload during the cruise was lighter than. After over 2 hours of flying, Captain Dubois contacted the Brazilian Atlantic Air Traffic Control Center after making the final radio call. The captain replied with a simple phrase, "All right, no problem." After that, Air France Flight AF447 officially entered the southern Atlantic airspace, where there was no longer any radio contact with air traffic control. That was also the last time the world would hear a voice from the cockpit, approximately 100 kilometers ahead of the aircraft. In the area north of the equator, a massive thunderstorm had fully developed. On the satellite image, the storm zone appeared as an extended large cluster. This was the Intertropical Convergence Zone. This weather phenomenon is formed from the interaction between the northeast trade winds of the northern hemisphere and the southeast trade winds of the southern hemisphere. It lifts moist air layers from forming strong cumulonimbus clouds. In May, almost every day, large storms appear north of the equator, over the Atlantic Ocean. These storm clouds cover vast areas and contain massive amounts of energy. Their tops sometimes rise even higher than the cruising altitude of commercial aircraft. For long-haul transoceanic flights, due to restricted air corridors, pilots are often forced to fly through thunderstorm zones. The flight crew had been briefed about the possibility. That evening, First Officer Bonin constantly monitored the radar screen to observe changes in the cloud layers along the flight path. Radar reflections in red zones kept flashing, indicating intense thunderstorms at their current cruising altitude. Given the situation, Bonin just climbing to a higher altitude to avoid the storm ahead. Bonin gave a verbal warning. Hearing this, Captain Dubois calmly replied, "I see it." However, he did not approve Bonin's suggestion, and for a clear reason. In his assessment, even if the aircraft climbed to its maximum cruising altitude, 11,277 meters, equivalent to 37,000 feet, the weather conditions would not improve. An extra 609 meters, or about 2,000 feet, would only reduce turbulence slightly, but could not avoid the storm. Moreover, at the maximum altitude, the air becomes thinner, reducing aircraft performance. The safe airspeed margin also narrows. Just a minor error. The aircraft could enter an overspeed state, or lose lift. The captain believed that if the situation became severe, such as encountering hail or severe turbulence, they could temporarily deviate slightly from the flight path to avoid the storm center. Entirely, there was no need to take the plane into the so-called where the safety margin is extremely narrow, easily leading to danger. Seeing the captain disregard his suggestion, Bonin, as first officer, chose not to press the issue. 11 minutes later, Flight AF447 crossed the equator and officially entered the northern hemisphere. At the same time, they began to reach the outer edge of the storm. To see the outside conditions more clearly, Bonin dimmed the cockpit lighting. Violent flashes of lightning kept erupting, illuminating the thick layers of dark clouds surrounding the aircraft. Seeing that scene, Bonin asked the captain again, would climbing now make things better? But Captain Dubois still had no intention of changing plans. He replied, if it's just turbulence, let's wait a bit. And just as he finished speaking, a strange blue glow, St. Elmo's fire, suddenly appeared on the windshield. It was an air ionization, signaling violent atmospheric disturbance around the aircraft. However, to Captain Dubois, who was quite familiar with the phenomenon, he showed no reaction at all. Waves of drowsiness swept over him, even stronger than the storm swirling outside. By then it was nearly 2 a.m. Captain Dubois and his girlfriend had enjoyed themselves too much the night before, so much so that before the flight, he had slept for barely an hour. After confirming that Bonin would be the one landing the aircraft, the captain rang the bell to wake the other first officer, Robert, to come to the cockpit. You asleep yet? All right then, I'm coming up. Before leaving his seat, Bonin quickly briefed Robert on the flight status. They were currently flying at an altitude of 10,668 meters, or 35,000 feet. They were about to enter a thunderstorm zone, unable to contact Atlantic air traffic control due to being out of Dakar's radar range, and with aircraft performance limitations, they couldn't climb higher. After finishing, Captain Dubois left the cockpit to rest. However, during the handover, he failed to give one critical instruction. He did not clearly specify who was in command during his absence, though he had previously said Bonin would be the landing pilot. Robert, who had just come in, was not present to hear that. He missed the information. This seemingly minor lack of clarity would later prove disastrous. 6 minutes after Robert took the captain's seat, Flight 447 was closing in on the storm's core. Aren't you going to bank left a bit? Robert asked. You could bank slightly to the left, he continued. Hearing that, Bonin adjusted the heading 12 degrees to the left to steer clear of a storm cell shown in red on the radar. Soon after, Bonin noticed the cockpit temperature rising. He also smelled something like fresh grass. Robert explained it was the smell of ozone, a gas produced when oxygen is ionized. But the changes underway weren't just about the scent in the cockpit. In a place neither pilot could see, the aircraft was silently altering the fate of everyone on board. In the early morning, the A330 was still flying over the Atlantic, raging through a violent storm. Strong turbulence and flashes of strange blue light, St. Elmo's fire, flickered on the windshield, making First Officer Bonin increasingly uneasy. 8 minutes after the strange signs began to appear, the aircraft carrying 228 people suddenly vanished into the night, without transmitting any distress signal. During flight, the A330's Pitot tubes measure air pressure, entering the aircraft's nose to calculate dynamic pressure, that is, forward airspeed. Meanwhile, static ports on both sides of the fuselage measure ambient atmospheric, static, pressure when the system subtracts static pressure from dynamic pressure via Pitot tubes. It calculates the aircraft's true airspeed. However, Pitot systems had previously encountered issues with icing, leading to blockages and data errors. In response, Airbus issued technical advisories recommending airlines to replace older model Pitot tubes. Ironically, the A330 operating this ill-fated flight was still using the outdated Pitot tubes, scheduled for replacement, immediately after it landed in Paris. Upon entering the turbulent storm zone, supercooled water and ice crystals in the air began accumulating inside the Pitot tubes, the instruments responsible for airspeed data. To prevent such situations, Pitot tubes are usually equipped with heaters to melt ice and prevent blockages. However, the older Pitot on this aircraft couldn't melt the steadily accumulating ice crystals throughout the extended time spent flying in the storm. This ice accumulation blocked airflow into the tubes, rendering the Pitot system completely ineffective. At that moment, the aircraft's computer systems could no longer calculate the current airspeed. Thus, while flying through the storm, Flight AF447 suddenly had both autopilot and auto throttle disengaged by the flight computer. A strong gust of wind then blew in, causing the aircraft to bank sharply right and start losing altitude. On the control panel, the displayed airspeed dropped from 275 knots to just 60. That's from about 509 kilometers per hour down to only 111 kilometers per hour, an extremely abnormal figure. At that moment, Bonin shouted, "I have control." He immediately tried to stabilize the aircraft. However, due to faulty airspeed data, the fly-by-wire control system switched from normal law to alternate law. In this mode, pilots must operate the side stick with much more finesse and caution. Yet Bonin handled it with heavy-handed, abrupt movements, lacking control. He repeatedly pulled the side stick backward, raising the aircraft's nose to return it to cruising altitude. However, this action was extremely dangerous, especially near the zone known as the coffin corner, where the margin of safe speed is very narrow. At that exact moment, a stall warning alarm sounded in the cockpit. "Stall. What's happening? We've lost airspeed readings." The stall warning alarm was joined by altitude alerts, indicating that the aircraft had exceeded its intended cruising altitude after attempting to climb back to altitude. At that moment, if Bonin had carefully corrected the aircraft's pitch, things might not have gotten worse. But because he kept pulling the stick back aggressively, the aircraft entered continuous oscillation, rolling left, then right. Bonin was fully focused on correcting the roll angle and overlooked the critical need to manage pitch and airspeed. The blaring alerts in the cockpit threw both pilots into a panic, a serious one. Robert, nearly stammering, tried reading data from the ECM to Bonin. He noticed that the aircraft was climbing again, with a climb rate over 1,800 meters per minute, equivalent to over 6,000 feet per minute, a dangerously high number. "Watch your climb rate," warned Robert. "I'm bringing it down now." Bonin replied. Hearing Robert's reminder, Bonin finally noticed and gently pushed the stick forward to reduce the climb rate. However, the aircraft was still climbing. Robert said again, "We're still climbing." "The altimeter shows we're still going up," Bonin replied. "I know. I'm coming back now." But after the aircraft climbed, the airspeed reading dropped by over 50 knots, around 93 kilometers per hour less than when the malfunction began. Bonin didn't realize that the climb had severely reduced the airspeed. Instead, he reduced the thrust, pulling the throttle back. This showed that Bonin had entered a state of disorientation, a loss of situational awareness. Meanwhile, Robert wasn't sitting idle. He tried switching the source of airspeed data to restore accurate speed readings on his display, and what he saw next shocked him deeply. The aircraft was at an altitude of 11,277 meters, about 37,000 feet, yet the actual airspeed was only around 183 knots, or approximately 339 kilometers per hour. Recognizing the danger, First Officer Robert repeatedly pressed the call button to wake the captain, hoping he could help. Meanwhile, both pilots in the cockpit were falling into panic. From the beginning, the ECM display, had shown over 10 different warnings. However, none of them mentioned unreliable airspeed, which was the most critical signal. Because of this absence, the pilots didn't carry out the required action, disabling the flight director indicator, which helps pilots manually control the plane. Instead, the flight director bar kept flashing, giving flight guidance, even though it too was misled by faulty data. When the airspeed indicators temporarily returned to normal, the flight director display switched to vertical speed mode, commanding a climb along the vertical axis. At about 426 meters per minute, or 1,400 feet per minute, in this high-stress situation, Bonin appeared to trust the computer's instructions more than his own judgment. Even as the stall warning sounded, he continued pulling the stick back, trying to stop the aircraft from descending. When the aircraft's angle of attack reached 16 degrees, aerodynamic lift had nearly disappeared. The 200-ton aircraft began to buffet and enter freefall. Although both first officers had been trained in stall recovery using simulators, they had never actually experienced a large jet like the A330 entering a real stall. In reality, the roar of the wind as the nose dropped and the violent shaking gave Bonin the opposite impression. He thought the aircraft was overspeeding. Unlike Boeing jets, which provide tactile stick shaker warnings, Airbus aircraft only use audible alerts during a stall. Combined with incorrect airspeed data, it's very likely the two pilots failed to realize they were experiencing a full stall. Airbus, unlike Boeing, does not feature stick shaking, a physical cue to warn pilots of a stall. Combined with the earlier faulty speed readings, the pilots most likely did not realize they were in a severe aerodynamic stall. According to their training, Bonin pushed the throttles to toga power to increase thrust, but instead of lowering the nose to gain speed by exchanging altitude, he continued to pull back on the stick. This action might work in a low-altitude stall, but was completely inappropriate at high altitude. The fatal difference was that neither first officer had ever been trained in high-altitude stall recovery procedures. As a result, Bonin continued acting on outdated instincts, unsuitable for this altitude. He kept responding based on low-altitude training. Bonin forcefully pulled the stick backward. At that same moment, the ice inside the Pitot tubes began to melt. The aircraft was now capable of registering accurate airspeed again. But with the angle of attack at 40 degrees, too steep, airflow couldn't enter the Pitot tubes properly, causing the stall warning to be temporarily disabled. As Captain Dubois entered the cockpit, the warning chimes continued blaring. "What are you two doing? What's going on here? I don't know what's happening. We're losing control of the aircraft. We can't control the plane. We're trying everything we can." As the captain, who had just awoken from a restless sleep, tried to grasp what was happening, Bonin suddenly retarded the throttles to idle and pushed the control stick forward. This maneuver allowed air to re-enter the Pitot tubes, which reactivated the stall warning. However, at that moment, Bonin was still convinced that the aircraft was overspeeding. "I feel like the plane is flying too fast. Don't you guys feel the same?" Immediately after saying that, Bonin even reached out to deploy the speed brakes. Just then, the captain spoke up. "Don't touch the speed brakes." Right after that warning, Bonin again pushed the throttles to full power. However, he still refused to push the stick forward to help the aircraft gain speed, but instead continued to pull it back. This action destroyed the final chance to save the aircraft. "So what do you think now? What do you think we should do next?" Captain Dubois was completely unaware of the events that led up to this. Amidst the suffocating chaos, he couldn't come up with a solution right away. "We're going down." After closely examining the instruments, the captain recognized the abnormal flight attitude. "Level it with the horizon." "You're going down." Bonin responded with confusion. "I'm going down." "Stabilize the aircraft." "I'm trying to." At this point, Bonin had completely lost awareness of the plane's attitude. Each time he pulled back on the stick to raise the nose, the stall warning would immediately re-engage. As the airspeed had dropped below 60 knots, about 111 kilometers per hour. Conversely, when he pushed the stick forward, air began to flow into the Pitot tubes again, causing the stall warning to reappear. This reversed warning behavior likely led Bonin to believe that pushing the stick forward was what triggered the stall warning, and that pulling back would stabilize the aircraft. Sadly, the reality was the opposite. When the plane descended to around 3,048 meters, 10,000 feet, Bonin cried out in despair, "Why are we still descending? I've been keeping the nose up this whole time, Right after those words, the captain finally realized what was going on. He shouted, "No, stop pulling up." Hearing the captain's cry, Robert finally understood too. Bonin was controlling the plane completely wrong. He immediately pushed his control stick fully forward. Unfortunately, Bonin was still subconsciously pulling his stick back. On Airbus aircraft, the sides are not physically linked. When both pilots give input, one pushing forward and the other pulling back, the electronic system averages the signals, causing no change in flight path. Realizing this, Robert shouted in desperation, "Let me fly. Give me control of the stick." The system was still in toga mode, maximum thrust used for takeoff or go around. As Robert finally gained full control of the stick, the aircraft began to gain speed again. But the acceleration triggered the stall warning once more. Bonin instinctively reacted. He pulled the stick back hard again. This completely canceled the acceleration trend. The plane resumed its deep descent in a severe aerodynamic stall. When an aircraft enters a full stall and freefall, its rate of descent becomes catastrophic. In less than 2 minutes, the plane fell from 11,277 meters, 37,000 feet, to just 1,219 meters, 4,000 feet. The ground proximity warning system began to issue alerts. Pull up, it blared. However, this final warning could not save the doomed flight AF447. The last chance for survival had officially vanished. Pull back together, Bonin urged, as both pilots simultaneously pulled their side sticks fully backward. The aircraft's pitch and angle of attack rose once again. In desperation, Bonin pressed the red button on his stick. This action meant he seized full control completely, and Robert's inputs were now disabled. After uttering in despair that the plane was really going down, something he still couldn't believe, Air France Flight AF447, with its nose pitched up 10 degrees, plunged straight into the Atlantic amid a fierce storm. 2 hours after the crash, authorities were clear. The aircraft had suffered a major incident. Based on the last transmitted data, Brazil quickly launched search and rescue operations. 2 days later, they found the first wreckage on the ocean, painted red, white, and blue, the colors of Air France, confirming it was part of AF447's fuselage. It took more than 2 years of relentless searching before the plane's black boxes were found at a depth of 0 meters below the ocean floor. The mystery of this horrific accident was finally unraveled. Ice crystals in the storm had blocked the Pitot tubes, causing the aircraft to lose airspeed data. Under extreme stress, the two pilots failed to realize that the aircraft had only lost airspeed data, not suffered a more serious malfunction. After hundreds of training hours on small aircraft, Bonin was placed in the cockpit of one of the most advanced airliners in the world. Throughout his career, he mostly relied on autopilot systems. Manual flying experience was almost negligible, and during Air France's training program, at that time, there was no training for stall recovery at high altitude. Bonin was taught that in normal flight conditions, even when pulling the stick hard, Airbus electronic system would prevent the plane from stalling. But he forgot that once switched to alternate law mode, that protection no longer applied. Pulling back the stick in that mode could indeed cause the aircraft to enter a severe stall condition. There is ample evidence showing Bonin believed the plane was overspeeding, not that it was stalling. This was the result of limited real-world experience and insufficient training. Had Captain Dubois immediately sat down and taken full control when he entered the cockpit, then with his experience, perhaps Flight AF447 might still have had a sliver of hope, even though at the final minute, he realized Bonin's grave handling mistake. It was already too late. Everything happened too fast. If we put all the blame on Bonin alone for the mistake of pulling the stick back, then we may overlook the deeper root causes. If, beforehand, Air France had trained its pilots to identify and handle high-altitude stalls, then from the start, both Bonin and Robert might have kept the plane stable. If Bonin hadn't been pushed too quickly into flying highly automated aircraft, then real-world experience would have taught him not to blindly trust displayed numbers, but but to rely on his own judgment, to overcome human instinct and remain rational, to see the true nature of the problem. Technology has made aviation safer than ever before, but human manual flying skills remain a crucial element in emergency situations. The tragedy of Flight AF447, with 228 lives lost, is a sobering wake-up call. How do we prevent similar tragedies? That is the greatest challenge facing aviation in the future.